Hello, everyone, and warm welcome to ANT Neuroeducational Webinar Series. My name is Farnoosh. I'm the head of education at ANT and upstream product manager in Imagine. And I'm happy to be hosting today's session, which is about MoBi for Cognition, New Frontiers in Understanding the Mind. Our presenter today is Dr. Francisco Parada, who is a cognitive psychologist and neuroscientist. He earned his PhD in cognitive psychology and neurosciences at Indiana University Bloomington and postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School. He is the current director of the Center for Human Neuroscience and Neurophysiology at the Psychology Department, Diego Portales University in Santiago, Chile. So before we get to the presentation, I would like to share a few points with you. In the course of the webinar, we will have a few poll questions to keep it more interactive. So we will appreciate your participations in the polls. Also, in the control panel in front of you, you have a section called questions. Please type your question there. Only the organizers can see those questions and ask from the presenter during the Q&A part. We will try to answer as many questions as possible within the time allocated to questions. And if not, we will always have the opportunity to contact the presenters to discuss them offline. And the contact information will be given to you at the end of the session. Okay, so let's get started. To know the audience a bit better, we'd like to begin with a couple of questions already. So I'm going to raise the first poll. Are you familiar with the concept of mobile brain body imaging? Okay, the poll is going on. Thank you for your participation. Let's give it 20 more seconds. So far, we have 135 participants and around 70% voted. Okay, let's close the poll and show the results. So most of you are slightly familiar with the concept. That's good to know. And the second poll is, are you familiar with the concept of 4E cognition? All right, 70% voted. Let's share the results. Never heard of it is the highest percentage. Okay, thanks a lot for the participation. It's very good for us to know the audience, and I would like to give the stage to Francisco to proceed.
All right. Thank you, Farnoosh, for your introduction. I guess that I have to switch screens. Can you, I guess that my...
Yes, we can see your screen.
You can see my slides. Okay, fantastic. So that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking today about MoBi and 4E cognition. I can see that the MoBi community is around here. You know, some people have some experience with it. However, the 4E cognition group apparently is not present at all. So this is interesting. So it's good because I'm going to be spending more time actually for recognition than MoBi. So let's begin. If I can only reach my slides, there we go. First of all, thank you, A&T Neuro, for organizing this educational web series. I think this is super interesting in the times that we're living in, so very useful. Thank you for that, and for having me over, giving me the opportunity to actually participate in this. This is a little roadmap that we're going to be following in the next 15 or 20 minutes. First, we're going to introduce a little bit and briefly the mobile brain body imaging concept for the ones that don't know about it. Then we're going to go into the 4E approach cognition, which I hope is going to give you a broad sense of what this is and get you interested into going a little bit deeper. And then we're going to be talking about new frontiers, and new frontiers with a question mark, because you will realize that these are all ideas coming back again and again. History repeats. So let's begin with mobile brain body imaging. Mobile brain body imaging in the last 10 years have been from TED Talks to books to special editions, in the European Journal of Neuroscience, which I think still open. So if you have something to send, please do so. And of course, the MoBi conference, which unfortunately had to be moved from 2020 to 2021, given the current sanitary crisis. So you still have the opportunity to attend next year in beautiful San Diego, California. So this community is growing, the community of brain-body imaging. And it's mainly because some very brave researchers have been doing things that they used to be thought as just madness. And also companies, partners like A&T or MBT, some other companies, they have been actually improving a lot the technologies. So the creation of dry electrodes for EEG, mobile systems such as Tobii Site Tracker, for example, you can see there, they even look good, whatever that means. You can go out in the streets wearing these systems, and you can record yourself buying coffee. Don't buy coffee from 7-Eleven, but anyway. And also you can go all the way up to fully suited, as here we can see what Professor Klaus Grammans has in his lab at TU Berlin, set up on virtual reality motion capture systems and high density electroencephalogram. So as you can see, equipment actually is now up to the point where we can actually start recording data that in the past seemed science fiction. So the main goal of mobile brain body imaging, we could say, is to model the brain dynamics during everyday natural real life situations. And that is something scientists wanted all along. You can find the literature, people writing in the 70s about the lack of ecological validity in psychological experiments and cognitive science. And nowadays, actually, technology allows it. And this is done by attaching lightweight sensors to participants during structures, semi-structured, and could be also unstructured settings. So basically, the degrees of freedom there are quite big. So in a sentence, for the person that is just starting about or just hearing about mobile brain body imaging, the goal is understanding cognition in its natural state. Natural cognition, as Klaus Graben has defined it. So in this very informative figure from Simon Ladoux's paper from 2017, you can see how we're moving from these really basic models of sensory inputs, motor outputs with the central nervous system, integrating those two, to models that are actually incorporating the environment into this loop. However, the goal is to actually go into more embedded, embodied environments where central nervous system or whatever your system of interest is within a body, and this body interacts with the environment. So we're actually moving towards that, I would say, and these are very good news for neuroscience. Luckily, evidence actually accompanies these ideas. And there's a bunch of theoretical and experimental work, which this list goes up until 2018. I realized that I have to update that because in the last couple of years has been booming. And the evidence shows that the whole system works towards what people could say, what the brain actually does, for cognition. Systems are also getting unstructured, so this is fantastic work by the group of Stefan Devener, Martin Bleichner, and colleagues. The secrets, which are very inconspicuous systems, that they can go around your ear and measure electroencephalogram. Check it out if you haven't so. And again, a figure from Simon Ledouce, where it shows that actually we are at the stage where we can mix and combine and use different sources of information, including brain dynamics, body physiology, and, for example, gaze dynamics or behavior in a way, using different kinds of equipment that all work sort of plug and play. You still need to tweak a little bit. Antonia is going to be showing us how simple this is nowadays. But the big question basically is, what people do that we want to measure? You could go out, see some protests there in Santiago, skip the protests, try to go and spend money you don't have in things you don't need. But basically that's what people do in real life. They go about their business, they commute, they work, they do a bunch of things in the real world. They do shopping. And the question is this what we really want to go and measure? Do we really want to go into shopping centers, the street, etc.? There's a little complication there, and something that you as a scientist, we as scientists, we should think about, So this idea of structured settings, semi-structured settings, and unstructured settings might be helpful in order to think about this, depending on your questions. If you really must go into unstructured, so going into the real world, absolutely real with no boundaries, you will definitely have a bunch of degrees of freedom, but very little control over your variables. However, going all the way into the laboratory setting, you will have very low behavioral degrees of freedom, lots of control of variables. You will be able to interpret your results. And of course, exists this in the middle ground semi-structure. And this is something that the MoBi world basically will have to incorporate in our designs, how to actually move back and forth from the real world to the drawing board in the laboratory, and then back to the real world, refining our hypothesis and trying to self-replicate our results. So this is a very dangerous road. You could easily go out and measure just noise, which has happened definitely to me when I've been trying some projects, when testing some projects. So I guess this is a good moment for our next poll, when we're going to be basically moving into the next slide, which is, it's dangerous to go alone. Take this, and this is what for recognition comes about.
Okay.
And here we are.
Before we transition to the next topic, let's have a quick poll. The MoBi approach is based on, please select one of the options. Okay, let's see the results. So Francisco, would you please help with the answer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say I would go with 1 and 2. It's not the current solution of all previous technical pitfalls. It would be fantastic if actually that would be true, but still there's a technical gap that we are facing. There's a technical gap for sure. So, and again, as the previous joke said, it's dangerous. So for recognition might be a way to actually guide this thing a little bit. So let's talk about the 4E cognition approach, which for I can see most of the attendees is completely new. So in a nutshell, 4E cognition defines cognition, this phenomenon that we are all interested in studying, as an embodied, embedded, extended phenomenon that is going to be better studied within an enactive perspective. What the hell does that mean, you might say? Well, first of all, it goes against, or it goes in opposition to the classical internalism approach that has reigned over cognitive neuroscience in the last couple of years, like the couple of decades, where everything goes inside the mind, inside the brain, in modern terms, starting with classical psychology in terms of the psychoanalytic approach. Everything was a product of the inner workings of the mind. The first E, the embodiment part, states that the body and the neurophysiological states emerging from it, being in the world, you can see how quickly we went into Merleau-Ponty. These are going to be mechanically and constitutively linked to the experience of being. This is a very important aspect of the proposal for recognition, because states and defines cognition as a material phenomenon, a natural phenomenon. Therefore, it can be studied and has to be studied from the biological and related disciplines. However, also puts a challenge there, because it's defined as being mechanically and constitutively linked to the experience. So that means that whatever experience you're trying to explain, might be emotional or psychological, there's got to be mechanisms, and those mechanisms are going to be systems mechanisms, so it's going to be networks, it's going to be complex mechanisms that are going to be constituting the phenomenon that you're going to be explaining. So that leaves immediately a source of questions that anybody in the MoBi world is already committed to. We're going to be measuring the brain and the body. And also adds a second part, which is basically, you see, that the brain is in a body, and that body has a history of being in the world. And that brings about the second E, which is embeddedness. The main idea basically is that both the natural and the built environment facilitate these meaningful interactions with the world and with others, for sure, and open relational possibilities for action. So they are also called affordances in the literature. So the fact that we have been modifying the environment in order to generate built environments have allowed humans to explore different areas of or develop different ways of interacting cognitively with the world. We do this a lot at the center that I direct. We have a little clinic for acquired brain lesions patients, and one of the strategies that works the best is actually modifying their spaces where they work and modifying their spaces in their homes. So that's the embeddedness concept in the real world, in the real clinics applications. And of course, we've mentioned the natural and the built environment. Therefore, it's impossible not to take them into account And that leads us into the third E, which is extendedness, which proposes at the very core is that in time, and this incorporates development, doesn't come natural for the brains. It has to interact with the world throughout development. Cognition is going to incorporate both the physical and even some philosophers argue sociocultural worlds into these larger arcs of contextualized perception action, spatiotemporal couplings. That sounds, it's a mouthful for sure. But what it's saying is basically that you are going to be incorporating into this larger act of perception action, or this larger act of cognitive acts. You're going to be incorporating both physical and cultural worlds. The physical one is very easy to understand. When you spend a lot of hours driving, sometimes the car might become part of your body. When you train yourself in music or something like that, the instruments also become, in a way, part of your body when you play them. So some people argue, and you can go into the literature and check out how the discussion is very heated. The sociocultural aspects actually cognition can be extended into that. So for example, if I'm really into Greenpeace, I might actually start adding some values and modifying my behavior and my understanding, my generation of meaning through the filters of whatever sociocultural enterprise that I have incorporated. That's kind of like the idea. So indeed, we'll go back into the nutshell that I gave you, and I hopefully now makes a little bit more sense. But there's one E that is still lacking, and is the most controversial, which is the enactive perspective. The enactive perspective basically tells you that when you ask the question, how does a mind work, and take into account the naturalistic, materialistic ground that embodiment gives you, the contextualized conditions for cognition that embeddedness makes you to think about, and this idea of evolution through time with physical and cultural spaces being part of the extension of cognition. The question of how does a mind work turns into a deeper and more complicated question that can be said, how can a mind emerge at all in the natural world? This little philosophical, and by little probably has not that much, but this philosophical problem is known in the literature as the life-mind continuity hypothesis, which is not quite panpsychism, but it says that basically life and cognition is very difficult to disentangle. This has very deep implications for theoretical approaches. You can check out Freeston's, for example, free energy principle is very linked and constituted to this idea of the life-mind continuity hypothesis. So let's try to summarize that. The 4E approach will define cognition as the emergent result, and that is important because it's emergent. It means that it's complex and it's more than just the old mechanisms that we were taught in biology classes. These are dynamic mechanisms. In the literature, you can find it as the new mechanicism. So it's going to be this result of complex multi-scale interactions in time. And time becomes again relevant, which is also good for electrophysiologists like me or cognitive electrophysiologists. The fact that time is all over the place, that's good. Which can be understood by the relatively independent disciplinary scientific work on physical, biological, psychological, social processes. That means that even though it might seem like super complicated as a definition of cognition, this can be understood by science because it's all materialistic and defines the disciplinary work as relatively independent, which is very important because it basically gives the cell biologist that is patch clamping his cell a reason that is working on a bigger system. You know, 4E scientists will always have the big picture in mind, even when doing patch clamps. And also looks into the future, into future resulting transdisciplinary efforts. So further readings and a poll, I think, at this time.
All right, let's go for the final poll. 4E cognition is an epistemological approach characterized by the following options. Please go ahead. All right, let's see the answer. It seems like the answer is pretty clear. Epistemic complexity and diversity. Would you agree, Francisco?
Absolutely. So that's one of the strongest points for the 4E approach, is that it's a diverse epistemological standpoint. That's usually something that bothers some philosophers of science, but allows the scientist to enjoy not only the possibility of look into larger arcs of explanatory levels while doing their small minutia centered disciplinary work, but also let them enjoy the complexity, you know, and that in combination with MoBi, which lets you enjoy the methodological complexity and diversity, are both together a very nice and very complete package for your whole ontological needs, if you might want to say. So further readings, you can go and read from 1966, this beautiful book called The Phenomenon of Life, all the way to 2018, the Oxford Handbook Cognition, Enacted Proposals for Sensory Motor Life by Ezequiel Di Paolo, the newest version of The Embodied Mind, it's a 1991 book by Francisco Varela, recently re-edited, and there's a lot to read there. And you will see, as a practicing scientist, that this is mostly has been for a while a theoretical and a philosophical ground. And MoBi finally, in a way, allows to bridge these two worlds. These are exciting times for doing novel research. And if you're not excited yet, you should be excited. I don't sound that excited because it's like 8:30 in the morning for me. So let's start wrapping up, because I promised it was going to be no more than 20 minutes. So let's talk about new frontiers. What can things there? One of the conclusions that you get from, or that I get at least, from the 4E approach to cognition, this big challenge, you know, for the MoBi 4E virtuous interaction, is that maybe we have to change our object of study, and that object of study is social interaction. This picture used to work in other presentations, but it's from a past long gone, where we could actually sit down on tables and spit at each other while we talk and ate. Nowadays, these kind of social interactions has changed, you know, but still the phenomenon of social interaction is still there and is still more relevant than ever, even in these times. So we have been pushing this idea of psychotherapy as a very nice setup for researching social interaction. And I wanted to share that with you a little bit as a teaser. The psychotherapy has some advantages. If you remember this distinction between completely organized or structured, semi-structured, and unstructured settings for research in MoBi, psychotherapy sits right in the middle as a semi-structured and has several advantages that some other settings might not have. First of all, it's an ecological situation. People go to psychotherapy for, it can be mental health needs, or even some people just go for health in general, you know. It's like an ecological situation. You don't have to call them. People just go and have been going for 100 or so years. Has pre-established and sustained interactional roles. So there's a patient or a client and there's a therapist, and that's it. They're going to be sustained in those roles with all the power differences that you might want for the rest of the therapy. And that's good as well, because pre-establishes hypotheses of interaction that you can go and tackle. Has low degrees of freedom of body movements, which means that they are not playing volleyball. You know, volleyball is also like a super cool environment because it's teamwork. You know, they are divided in two sides. You know, and they have to kind of be reading their minds and doing physical activity right away. But sand is a problem, and a lot of movement is also a problem. So psychotherapy, actually, people are sitting down and they are doing small movements, you know, with their bodies, facial expressions and stuff like that, that you can easily record. You could use motion capture systems, but you can definitely use just regular cameras, and that's what we do. Pre-establish session length and location. You know that the experimental session is going to last 45 minutes, and that's it. You know, it might, some other therapists will do 30 minutes, some other do 50, but it will not last more than an hour, and that's set. So you can actually tell your patients and your participants, you're going to be in the psychotherapy environment this week for no less, or sorry, no more than an hour. And the location is always the same, which is the psychotherapist's, you know, clinic or whatever. You have a way to actually establish clinically relevant interactions. You can actually go and establish and identify portions of the interactions during the recorded psychotherapy that can be actually used as epochs or as trials, if you might want to actually think in the event-related paradigm. You can actually get that. And if you get fancy, you can actually use words as your triggers. Even if you're using some sort of eye metric, you can also use eye movements as your triggers. So there's a bunch of options depending on your equipment and your possibilities, technical possibilities to actually mark behavior. Has this natural turn-taking approach because it's a conversation about one of the participants. So it's not just a random conversation in the pub where someone might just go and talk on and on. We all have that friend. It has a longitudinal development of a therapeutic relationship. That's a unique opportunity. So at the very beginning of the session, you will find a professional practitioner and a person that is in need, looking for interactional help, and they are going to be building a healing relationship, and that's just unique. You just can't. I cannot think of any other place where you could actually record that kind of thing. And you will be able to record every single interaction up until the end of it. So that therapeutic relationship is a human relationship, it's a real relationship, it's a healing relationship, and you have access to it. Many others. This is what a typical psychotherapy setting looks like. You know that you have a patient here and a psychotherapist. You can see back in the day we were doing just handicaps recording. Faces are blurred for ethical reasons. One of the common approaches we do is we do regions of interest, so basically their bodies, and we can extract some statistics and eventually end up with some time series of how much they move. This kind of analysis people do all the time in animal behavior ethology, basically, for whiskers and stuff like that. And then you can see, these are very preliminary data, that at the very beginning of the therapy, this graph basically shows you who is moving the most, who's leading and who's following. And here's on the right side of the panel, you can see the therapist, and on the left one, you can see the patient. You can see that at the beginning of the therapy, it's the therapist that actually does most of the moving and most of the talking. By the middle of the therapy, you can definitely see that they are pretty much dancing. The synchronization and the groove that you can actually have between them is clear in their body movements. Those are very interesting data. More radical approach, you can actually record physiology. Here you have some EEG with accompanying heart dynamics. You could grab just a little bit of that, and turn it into a matrix. Those matrices, you can actually model them as a connectome if you want. I toy them with the word interactomes, and then model the system as a whole, where the nodes from the therapist and the nodes from the patient are all modeled together in order to find some sort of like edge probability. You could say, well, during this interaction, the physiology, the brain-body dynamics were more coupled between this system, and then it kind of dissolves as the session or the interaction goes about. This theoretical example shows you that you could actually model the interaction, the social interaction going on in the therapy using very advanced techniques. And why is that? Because basically the goal is understanding the brain-body system at these multiple dimensions, levels, and scales. You might be doing genetic, you might be doing cellular work, but within the 4E cognition approach, your disciplinary work is relatively independent from anything else. Therefore, you are invited to keep your eyes open and keep your filters open as well, and see the big picture as you work in your low level work, or if you're like up there in sociology or something like that, also looking down into the other levels of complexity. And as the current situation show us, these networks, they might be more related than we think. Data is showing already how from gene regulation networks to physiological networks, they're all impacting how we manage in the world. And right now, that we are all confined in our houses, or most of us are, we can see how these other networks are also very, very connected to what our cognitive abilities are. And lately, of course, contagion networks. In a way, you can see all these nested systems, and at some point we'll have to be including probably even more data in our mobile brain-body imaging and 4E cognition approaches. So I would like to wrap up there so we can actually have some discussion and see the demo that Antonia has prepared. Thanks to the people that give me money to do the stuff that I like to do, Fondesit, and basically the Chilean government, my university, and MIDAP, and the 3 faculty that work with me, Alejandro Rossi, Cristian Salas, Daniel Rojas, and everybody else that help us doing this stuff. Thank you.